I still remember the first time I heard about Claire Donovan's disappearance. It was the summer of 2017, a year that etched itself into the heart of Montana with a mix of beauty and tragedy, and though I had been no more than a stranger to her at the time, her story would soon worm its way into my own life like a shadow that refused to leave. Claire wasn't just another hiker who went missing, at least not to the people who knew her. She was 32 years old, sharp-minded, fiercely independent, and stubborn in a way that drew both admiration and frustration from anyone who had ever tried to sway her. A woman who worked as a freelance wildlife photographer, she had built a small but devoted following online through images of Montana's rugged mountain valleys, snow-capped peaks, and the restless rivers that cut through the wilderness like veins of silver. She had grown up in Missoula, spending much of her youth in the forests of the Bitterroot Range, where her father had taught her how to track elk, identify edible plants, and respect the land as if it were a living, breathing elder. For Claire, hiking was not just recreation, it was both therapy and vocation, a way of stepping beyond the walls of ordinary life into something older, something primal. That summer, she had set out on what was supposed to be a 4-day trek through the Absaroka-Beartooth wilderness, a swath of land so vast and untamed that even seasoned rangers confessed it could swallow a human whole without leaving so much as a footprint. She had told friends she wanted to photograph the rare alpine meadows in peak bloom and maybe catch sight of the elusive wolverine, a creature she claimed had haunted her dreams since childhood. Equipped with her camera, a small pack, a compass, and enough supplies to last nearly a week, Claire vanished into the tree line one July morning, her car parked neatly at a trailhead near Pine Creek Lake. When she didn't return on the date she'd promised, search crews fanned out across the wilderness. Helicopters scanned ridges and river valleys. Dogs were brought in. Volunteers combed the trails in groups of 20, then 30, then 50. They found nothing. No footprints beyond the first few miles, no discarded gear, no torn clothing, not even a broken branch that might have hinted at her direction. It was as if the earth itself had opened its mouth and devoured her whole. I wasn't involved back then, not directly. I was working as a freelance journalist out of Billings, trying to make ends meet with whatever scraps of stories I could gather. Missing hiker cases were not uncommon in Montana. People came here chasing solitude, chasing something wild and eternal, and sometimes that wilderness demanded payment. But Claire's case lingered. It stayed in the papers longer than most. It became the kind of unsolved disappearance people whispered about in diners, in gas stations, and around campfires, a story tinged with both mystery and dread. Her family pressed for answers, hiring private investigators and pushing the sheriff's department to keep the case alive long after official search efforts had dwindled. And through it all, her trail remained cold, her absence a wound that refused to heal. 6 years later, in the autumn of 2023, I found myself driving a narrow dirt road deep into the Gallatin Range, the steering wheel vibrating beneath my hands as gravel rattled against the undercarriage. By then, I had stumbled into the orbit of Claire's story almost by accident. A fellow journalist, an old college friend, had mentioned her case to me during a late-night conversation, saying, "You should look into it. There's something off. Too many details don't add up." At first, I brushed it aside. Missing persons cases rarely led to anything more than heartbreak and loose ends. But the more I read, the more something about Claire pulled me in. Maybe it was the sheer strangeness of the vanishing, how she could walk into the woods with clear skies above and supplies on her back and never be seen again. Or maybe it was the look in her photographs, the way she caught moments of fragile wilderness as though she were communing with something no one else could see. The cabin where I was headed had been abandoned for decades, according to county records. It was a relic from the 1940s, when trappers and hunters still built rough shelters deep in the mountains to survive long winters. Locals whispered that it was cursed, though most of them just said that to keep kids away from a place that had rotted back into the earth. No one had thought much about it until a wildfire the year before had swept through the forest, burning away underbrush and exposing structures that had long been hidden. A hunting guide, scouting the area in early September, had stumbled upon the cabin and reported it to authorities. Sheriff's deputies had gone in to check it out, not expecting anything more than a pile of caved-in logs and rusted nails. What they found instead was a chimney, still intact despite the fire, that contained something wedged inside. Something that, when pried loose, would reignite a mystery that had slept for 6 long years. I parked my truck near the clearing where the cabin stood, the charred remains of its walls jutting up like blackened ribs against the sky. The air carried the acrid tang of old fire, mingled with the damp sweetness of pine sap. My boots crunched over ash as I approached the chimney, a pillar of stone stubbornly refusing to fall. There were still markings around it, footprints, the kind that come from official boots, from deputies and forensic teams who had already combed the site. I had managed to secure permission to examine it myself, more through persistence than charm, after weeks of pestering the sheriff's office with calls and emails. By then, the discovery inside the chimney had already been removed and catalogued. But I wanted to stand there, to breathe the same air, to feel the place where that terrible secret had been hidden. The object they had found was a camera. Or, more precisely, the rusted remains of one, a DSLR so corroded by time, weather, and heat that it barely resembled a machine at all. Its strap was tangled around what looked like scraps of clothing, fragments so brittle they crumbled at a touch. The serial number on the camera, however, was still legible enough for identification. It matched the one registered to Claire Donovan, purchased from a photography store in Missoula just 3 months before she vanished. That camera, lodged inside the chimney of a remote cabin miles away from her intended trail, had sat in darkness for years, holding inside it the possibility of answers. Maybe the memory card had survived. Maybe there were photographs no one had seen. Or maybe it was only a cruel artifact, a reminder of a life that had flickered out in the vast Montana wilds. When I first learned about the discovery, I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. The idea of a missing woman's camera hidden in a chimney raised more questions than it answered. Who had placed it there? Had Claire herself sought shelter in the cabin, only to meet some unspeakable fate? Or had someone else taken her camera, someone who had crossed her path out in the wilderness and left her story unfinished? The sheriff's department was tight-lipped about the details, but whispers trickled out. Some said there were partial photographs still recoverable from the card. Others claimed the chimney had been deliberately sealed, as if someone wanted the camera hidden, not lost. Whatever the truth, I knew I had to chase it. Standing in the clearing, staring at the skeletal remains of that cabin, I felt the weight of silence pressing in. It was the kind of silence that made you wonder if the trees themselves were listening, if the mountains carried memories in their stone bones. I imagined Claire walking these same woods, her camera slung around her neck, her eyes scanning the ridges for a glimpse of a wolverine or a hawk circling against the sky. Did she pass this cabin by chance? Did she step inside to escape a storm? Or was she brought here by force, her footsteps erased, her fate sealed within these walls? The question swirled, heavy and unrelenting, and I realized that my journey had only begun. I spent the following week sinking deeper into Claire Donovan's life, piecing together fragments of a woman who had once walked the Montana wilderness as if it belonged to her alone. Every time I opened her old blog or scrolled through her archived social media posts, I felt as though she were still out there somewhere, waiting on the other side of the screen, just beyond reach. Her photographs were windows into a life that balanced on the edge of solitude and obsession, mountain ridges glowing orange at dawn, a fox staring straight into her lens with wild intelligence, fields of lupin trembling in the wind. In her captions, she wrote with the conviction of someone who believed the earth spoke in signs, that every shadow and flicker of light held meaning. The mountains keep secrets, she had once typed beneath a shot of a storm rolling over Granite Peak. If you're quiet long enough, sometimes they whisper back. It was poetic, almost eerie, and it set the tone for the rabbit hole I was tumbling down. Her family, I learned, had never accepted the easy explanation that Claire had simply slipped off a cliff, drowned in a stream, or become lost until exhaustion overtook her. Her younger brother, Adam, was particularly vocal about it. A wiry man with restless eyes, Adam had spent years retracing his sister's last known steps, plastering forums with theories, clashing with law enforcement when their interest waned. She was too smart, too damn careful, he told me over the phone when I reached out. She knew those trails better than most guides. Something happened to her. Something they don't want to admit. He said as if the entire weight of the sheriff's office, the state, and maybe even nature itself had conspired against her. His conviction was unsettling, but it carried a kind of raw truth, the kind that made me lean closer, take notes faster, and promise myself I'd meet him in person. Adam was the one who told me about the cabin before I ever set eyes on it. He had been there himself, slipping past the yellow tape days after the sheriff's deputies closed their search. "You ever seen a chimney like that?" he asked me. "It's like it wanted to keep something inside. The stones, too neat, too tight for a hunting shack. My guess? Somebody put that camera there on purpose." He didn't say who. He didn't have to. The unspoken suggestion hung between us like smoke, that another presence had stalked those woods 6 years ago, that Claire had not been alone in her final hours. The more I dug, the more threads began to tangle. I found an old incident report buried in county archives from the summer of 2017. 2 hikers, a married couple from Bozeman, had filed a strange complaint 3 days after Claire was last seen. They claimed they heard screaming in the distance near Pine Creek Lake one night, a high, sharp cry that echoed across the canyon. They thought at first it was an animal, but then it came again, human, unmistakable. Search crews had investigated, but dismissed it as either a mountain lion or the echoes of their own imagination. Still, the detail gnawed at me. If Claire had been in trouble, if she had called out, then someone should have found something. But the wilderness is merciless. Sound scatters. Darkness confuses. And the forest has a way of swallowing even the loudest cries. There was another detail, one that barely made it into the official record. A ranger who had participated in the initial search, a man named Daniel Hale, had written a private note in his field journal, which somehow ended up scanned into the digital archive. In shaky handwriting, he described finding what looked like the remains of a fire pit near an unmarked game trail, about 8 miles off Claire's intended route. Scattered around the ashes were half-burnt scraps of paper, one of which bore ink smudges that looked like handwriting. Hale had flagged it for evidence, but the report stopped there. No follow-up, no analysis, no mention in the public record. Had it been lost, dismissed, or buried? When I pressed the sheriff's office about it, they grew cagey. "Old notes get messy," the deputy told me. "Not everything makes it into the official case file. Don't go reading too much into it." But I couldn't help myself. If Claire had started a fire, if she had written something, then it meant she had survived long enough to realize she was in trouble. It meant she hadn't simply vanished into thin air. The chimney haunted me most of all. I dreamed of it. The way its black stones rose from the earth, like a grave marker. I pictured Claire crouched inside, clutching her camera, maybe using it as her last defense, capturing something terrible before hiding it away. But how had the camera ended up lodged so deep inside? Had she forced it there with her own hands, hoping someone would find it? Or had another pair of hands shoved it in, sealing it like a coffin? Each possibility carried its own horror. I began driving long, lonely roads, retracing the areas where she had once walked. The forests grew thick, oppressive, with shadows that stretched like fingers across the ground. In the evenings, I'd sit at diners with laminated menus and overhear locals murmuring her name as if it were a ghost story. One old man told me, "That girl wasn't the first. People go missing up there all the time. But the woods, they don't give back what they take unless they want to." His words stayed with me, sticking like burrs under the skin. Eventually, I made arrangements to meet Adam in person. He lived in a rundown rental house on the edge of Livingston, surrounded by stacks of maps, photographs, and boxes overflowing with case notes. His living room looked more like a detective's war room than a home. String-connected pins on a giant map of the Absaroka-Beartooth wilderness. Dates and sightings were scrawled in red ink. In the middle of it all was a single photo of Claire, taped to the wall, her smiling at the summit of a mountain, hair wild in the wind, eyes bright with a kind of freedom that felt eternal. She was my sister, Adam said, handing me a folder of documents. "Not just a case file. Don't forget that." I promised I wouldn't. He showed me copies of emails between his family and the sheriff's office, growing more desperate with each year that passed. He showed me an envelope of photographs he had taken at the cabin site himself. One of them, a close-up of the chimney stones, made my stomach twist. There, etched faintly into the soot-stained surface, were marks, scratches, almost like clawing. They could have been from time, from weather, from nothing at all. But Adam believed they were hers. "She tried to tell us something," he whispered. "She left her story in that chimney." It was then, sitting in that cluttered room with papers strewn around me, that I realized I was no longer just a journalist chasing a lead. I was becoming entangled in something older, deeper, something that reached back to that July morning when Claire walked into the wild and never came back. The discovery in the chimney was not an ending. It was the beginning of a trail that curved into darkness, and I was already too far along to turn back. The deeper I sank into Claire's story, the more I began to feel the pull of the wilderness itself, as if the mountains were drawing me in the same way they had drawn her 6 years earlier. I spent more time driving lonely backroads, my notebook riding shotgun, my recorder full of whispered thoughts and half-baked theories. At night, I'd replay the scratchy audio of my own voice, sometimes layered with a faint howl of wind leaking through my truck's window seals, and wonder if I was losing the thread between journalist and obsession. Claire had walked into the Absaroka-Beartooth as a photographer, but what had she walked out as? Or had she walked out at all? That chimney, standing like a sentry in a clearing of ash, suggested otherwise. And if her camera had been sealed inside, then her story had not ended on the trail. It had ended somewhere far more deliberate. I returned to the cabin site in late October, the first hints of winter brushing the peaks with snow. The forest was quiet, almost reverent, as though the trees remembered what had been hidden there. I crouched by the chimney, running my fingers along the soot-stained stones. The scratches Adam had shown me in his photographs were faint, but undeniable. I traced them with my fingertip, imagining nails dragging desperately against stone, the sound swallowed by thick timber walls. My stomach churned. If those marks truly belonged to Claire, then her last moments had not been silent resignation. They had been a fight, a struggle, a desperate attempt to leave behind proof that she had existed, that something had happened to her here. The sheriff's department had released no photographs of the recovered camera, but Adam shared what little he had learned through contacts and whispers. A technician working on the memory card had confirmed that fragments of images remained, though most were corrupted. One file, however, stood out, a blurred shot of a cabin interior, dark and claustrophobic, with what looked like a hand reaching across the frame. The photo had not been made public, but Adam swore its metadata placed it within days of her disappearance. She was alive then, he told me, eyes blazing. Alive and inside that cabin. That thought haunted me. Claire had been trapped, not lost. I began retracing possible routes she could have taken from Pine Creek Lake to the cabin site. It didn't add up. The cabin was miles away, in rough terrain rarely crossed by casual hikers. To reach it, she would have had to abandon the marked trails and plunge into uncharted wilderness. Why would she do that? Had she stumbled upon something or someone that led her there? The more maps I studied, the more I realized she couldn't have reached the cabin by accident. Someone had guided her or forced her. It was during one of these long nights poring over topographic charts that I discovered something unsettling. An old USGS survey from the 1960s marked not just one cabin but several, scattered across the Gallatin Range. Most were long gone, collapsed or erased by time, but this one had remained. And beside its crude symbol on the map was a notation, Sloan Homestead. The name meant nothing to me at first, but a little digging turned up fragments of local lore. The Sloan family had settled the area in the late 1800s, trappers and traders who lived off the land. Rumors painted them as reclusive, hostile, a family that shunned outsiders. Some said they dabbled in things better left unspoken. Others claimed they simply vanished one winter, leaving their cabin to rot. If Claire had somehow stumbled into a place steeped in such stories, then her disappearance took on an even darker hue. I decided to interview locals in Livingston and Big Timber, towns where old families still carried the oral histories of the mountains. At a bar lined with elk antlers and faded photographs, I spoke with a man named Walter who claimed to have explored the Sloan cabin as a teenager in the 1980s. "There was something wrong with it," he muttered over his whiskey. "Place felt watched. We found bones in the chimney back then, animal, I think, but we never stayed long enough to be sure." My buddies swore they heard footsteps outside when no one was there. His eyes flicked nervously toward the door, as though even now the memory followed him. "I'm telling you, son, that cabin wasn't just wood and stone. It held on to things. Still does." The more stories I collected, the more the Sloan name began to twist around Claire's case like a vine. Some said descendants of the family still lived off-grid in the wilderness, shunning the modern world. Others claimed their bloodline had ended long ago, leaving only ghosts behind. I couldn't separate fact from folklore, but I knew this. Claire's path had crossed with something tied to that cabin, whether human or not. And whatever had happened to her, someone or something had wanted her camera hidden away. Back in Livingston, I arranged another meeting with Adam. His obsession had deepened into something raw and dangerous. His maps now bore not just pins and strings but scrawled accusations. Sloan family, Ranger Hale, why missing note? Sheriff covering? He leaned across the table, jabbing his finger at the map. They all knew. Someone led her there, and when she tried to document it, they made sure her story never got out. His voice cracked, heavy with years of frustration and grief. I tried to calm him, remind him that theories without proof were fragile, but deep down, I feared he might be right. That night, I couldn't sleep. I drove out into the mountains, parked near the charred remains of the cabin, and sat with only the ticking of my cooling engine for company. The forest pressed close, shadows shifting in the moonlight. I imagined Claire sitting in that very clearing, her breath clouding in the cold, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her camera. What had she seen? What had she tried to capture in that final, blurred image? And why had her story ended here, hidden in a chimney that refused to fall? As dawn crept over the ridges, painting the peaks in pale gold, I felt something stir in the silence. Not a sound, not a sight, but a presence, an awareness that the land itself was holding on to secrets I had only begun to uncover. Claire Donovan had not simply vanished. She had left behind echoes, and if I was willing to follow them, I might uncover the truth. But the truth, I realized, might be far darker than I had ever imagined. In the weeks that followed, I lived as though Claire's ghost were riding my shoulders. Every waking hour became tethered to her, and even in sleep I found myself drifting through endless forests, chasing the flicker of a camera strap vanishing into shadows. My work as a journalist fell to the wayside. I stopped answering assignments, stopped filing copy, stopped living any life beyond the one tangled in Claire's. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was compulsion. Something inside me told me that if I didn't follow this trail, no one else would. Whatever truth lingered in those mountains would rot in silence, buried under snow and ash. I began interviewing anyone who had been part of the original search effort back in 2017. Most were reluctant, some flat out refused. They'd moved on, or at least pretended they had. But one man, a retired ranger named Carl Benson, agreed to meet me at a diner off Highway 89. He was in his 70s, wiry, with sun-leathered skin and hands that trembled when they held his coffee cup. He remembered Claire well. Bright girl. Knew her way around the backcountry, he said, voice heavy with something like guilt. We looked for her for weeks. I thought for sure we'd find her pack, her boots, something. But it was like chasing smoke. When I asked him about the cabin, his eyes hardened. We weren't supposed to go near it, he muttered. Sheriff's orders. Said it was too unstable, too dangerous. But that never sat right with me. The place has history. Bad history. You could feel it. He leaned closer, his breath smelling of bitter coffee. There were stories even back then, about a woman, long before Claire, who went missing near that same cabin. Some folks swore they saw lights in the chimney at night, like a lantern burning where no one lived. But when you got close, it was always dark. Always empty. You want my advice? Let it lie. Some places don't give answers. They just take. But I couldn't let it lie. I couldn't let her lie. Claire had left something behind, and that meant she wanted to be found. I spent nights combing through old county records, property deeds, anything that mentioned the Sloan homestead. Most files had been lost in a courthouse fire decades ago, but one battered ledger from 1912 mentioned J. Sloan paying taxes on remote acreage in the Gallatin Range. No heirs were listed after 1935. It was as though the family line had simply evaporated. Yet the cabin remained. The chimney stood. And Claire's camera had been entombed there like a relic waiting for discovery. Then came the night Adam called me, his voice ragged with both excitement and fear. "I got the files," he whispered. "The ones the sheriff didn't want us to see." He refused to say more over the phone, insisting I drive out to Livingston. When I arrived, his house was darker than usual, blinds drawn, lights off except for a single lamp illuminating the chaos of his war room walls. He handed me a thin folder, his hands shaking. Inside were photocopies of evidence logs from 2017. Most were standard: boots, a water bottle, scraps of food wrappers, but one page caught my eye. Item number 47. Charred notebook fragment. Illegible writing. Location: unmarked fire pit, 8.2 miles off trail. I stared at the line, heart pounding. This was the very note Ranger Hale had scribbled about in his journal, the one that had disappeared from the official record. Why didn't they follow up? I asked. Adam's laugh was hollow. Because they didn't want to. Because it didn't fit their narrative of a hiker lost to the wilderness. But that notebook was hers, I know it. The next day, I drove to Bozeman to track down Hale himself. He'd retired early, moved into a small cabin of his own near Highlight Canyon. When I knocked on his door, he looked surprised, almost afraid, but he let me in. His living room was sparse, decorated with maps and old ranger badges. I asked him about the fire pit, the notebook. For a long time he said nothing, just stared out the window at the trees beyond. Finally he sighed. "We found more than we reported," he admitted. There were words.
Faint but there.
A name.
Sloan.
We logged it, handed it over. And then it was gone. Never made it to the case file.
His jaw tightened.
Don't ask me where it went. Don't ask me why. Just know this. Whatever happened to that girl, it wasn't the forest that took her. Hearing him say it out loud was like a door slamming shut behind me. The wilderness was cruel, yes, but it was indifferent. It didn't scratch names into notebooks, didn't stuff cameras into chimneys. Someone had been with Claire. Someone tied to that cursed family name, a family that should have been dust long before she ever walked those trails. The nights grew colder, longer. Snow dusted the peaks, crept lower each week. I knew the mountains would soon be impassable, and with them, the trail to Claire's truth. But the urgency only sharpened my resolve. I found myself returning to the cabin again and again, standing before the chimney until my breath came in clouds, until frost slicked the stones. Each time I felt it more strongly, a presence, a memory, something watching. And each time I swore, I heard faint echoes, whispers, scratches, maybe just the groan of wood settling in the cold. But maybe not. One evening, as I packed up my gear, I caught sight of movement in the tree-line. A figure, half-hidden, watching me. My pulse spiked. I shouted, but the figure slipped away, silent as smoke. Tracks in the snow led deeper into the woods, but darkness was falling fast, and I dared not follow unprepared. Still, the sight burned into my mind. Someone else was out there. Someone who didn't want me poking around the ruins of the Sloan cabin. That night I sat awake in my truck, doors locked, staring into the forest until dawn. My notebook lay open on the passenger seat, Claire's name scrawled again and again across the page, as though writing it could tether her back to this world. I realized then that I was no longer just investigating her disappearance. I was walking the same path she had walked, step for step, shadow for shadow. And I couldn't shake the fear that if I kept going, the mountains would claim me too. The snow came heavier than expected that November, draping the Gallatin Range in a silence so thick it felt like the world had been muffled. I drove through it anyway, chains on my tires, breath fogging the windshield as I made my way back toward the ruins of the Sloan cabin. Something inside me had shifted since the night I saw that figure in the trees. Curiosity was no longer enough. I felt hunted, as though whatever had swallowed Claire was now circling me too. Yet the fear only deepened my determination. If she had fought to leave behind scraps of her story, then I owed her the same fight to pull the truth into daylight. I wasn't alone this time. Adam insisted on coming with me, his jaw set in grim resolve. He carried a rifle slung across his shoulder, though I wasn't sure if it was for protection against mountain lions or against whatever secrets we might stir loose. We hiked in silence, our boots crunching through snow that reached nearly to our knees. The forest was a cathedral of white, branches heavy with ice, the air sharp enough to sting our lungs. Every sound seemed amplified, the crack of a twig, the distant creak of frozen wood. My nerves buzzed like live wires. When we reached the clearing, the cabin looked even more skeletal under the snow, its blackened beams jutting from drifts like bones. The chimney stood tall, crowned with frost, as if mocking us. Adam stared at it for a long time before finally speaking. "She was here," he whispered. "I can feel it." He crouched near the base, brushing away snow with his gloved hands. That's when he found it, a small metal clasp, half buried in the dirt, tarnished with age. He held it up, eyes wide. "It's from her pack," he said. "I'd know it anywhere." The discovery rattled me. If Claire's belongings were still surfacing here 6 years later, then perhaps more waited beneath the snow and ash. We began to dig, carefully, methodically, using small trowels and our hands. Hours passed, the sun dipping behind the peaks, but our persistence paid off. Adam unearthed something wrapped in brittle fabric, frozen solid. When we pried it open, my breath caught. It was a notebook, the same size and make as the one Hale had described. The edges were scorched, the paper fragile, but legible words still clung to its pages. We carried it back to my truck, hands shaking with anticipation, and spread it open under the dim beam of a flashlight. Most of the writing was ruined, ink blurred by fire and time, but fragments remained. The first page we could read bore a date, July 15th, 2017, 2 days after Claire had set out. The entry was short, hurried. "Not alone. Thought I heard footsteps. Not sure if animal. Watching me." My stomach clenched. She had known. She had felt it too, the same presence that now seemed to haunt me. Another fragment read, "Storm coming. Found shelter. Cabin." The word was underlined twice, the ink jagged as though written in haste. And then another entry, the most chilling of all, Sloan. He said name Sloan. The rest of the page was burned away, but those words were enough to freeze the air in my lungs. Someone had spoken to her. Someone tied to the cursed name that kept reappearing in whispers and half-buried histories. Adam slammed his fist against the dashboard. I knew it. She wasn't lost, she was taken. Someone led her here. His voice cracked, torn between triumph and anguish. I couldn't disagree. The evidence was undeniable now. Claire had reached the cabin alive, and she had encountered someone. Someone who knew the Sloan name. Whether a descendant, a drifter, or something darker, I didn't yet know. But it meant her disappearance wasn't an accident. It was an act. We debated what to do next. Turning the notebook over to authorities would likely bury it again, lost in files or dismissed as inconclusive. But keeping it meant carrying a dangerous weight. Whoever had placed her camera in that chimney might still be out there, watching. If they learned we now held the notebook, what would they do? The thought gnawed at me, but in the end, we decided to keep it secret for now. The truth belonged to Claire, and to those who still fought for her. Over the following days, I scrutinized every surviving page, every mark of ink. The fragments painted a picture of fear and confusion. Claire had sensed someone trailing her. She had veered off the main trail, perhaps guided or forced, until she stumbled upon the cabin. She had tried to write, to document, but fire had nearly erased her testimony. Nearly, but not entirely. Enough remained to prove she had not walked willingly into oblivion. The more I studied the notebook, the more I began to feel as though I were communing directly with her. Her handwriting was frantic, uneven, so unlike the calm captions beneath her photographs. I could almost hear her voice in the scrawls, the rising panic as she realized she was no longer alone in the wilderness. Each word was a plea across time, a lifeline thrown 6 years into the future, into my hands. I promised her silently that I wouldn't let it be wasted. But with every step closer to the truth, the danger grew. Twice I noticed tire tracks near my truck where none should have been. Once, while leaving Adam's house, I spotted a figure across the street, half hidden in shadow, watching. When I shouted, the figure melted into the night. My pulse hammered as I realized that Claire's fate wasn't the only one at stake anymore. The same presence that had circled her was circling me now. Still, I couldn't stop. I followed the trail of the Sloan name through dusty archives, old newspapers, whispered rumors passed down in barrooms and farmhouses. A picture began to emerge of a family marked by violence and isolation, a lineage that faded from official record, but not from memory. Some claimed a Sloan descendant still roamed the mountains, living feral, half-wild. Others swore the family line had ended in madness and blood. But Claire had written the name in her notebook. She had heard it spoken. That meant at least one Sloan had still been alive in 2017 and had crossed her path. As the days grew darker, I felt the line between past and present blurring. I wasn't just telling Claire's story anymore. I was walking inside it. And somewhere out there, in the frozen silence of Montana's wild heart, I knew the one who had spoken that name was still watching, waiting, daring me to come closer. The snow came heavier than expected that November, draping the Gallatin Range in a silence so thick it felt like the world had been muffled. I drove through it anyway, chains on my tires, breath fogging the windshield as I made my way back toward the ruins of the Sloan cabin. Something inside me had shifted since the night I saw that figure in the trees. Curiosity was no longer enough. I felt hunted, as though whatever had swallowed Claire was now circling me too. Yet the fear only deepened my determination. If she had fought to leave behind scraps of her story, then I owed her the same fight to pull the truth into daylight. I wasn't alone this time. Adam insisted on coming with me, his jaw set in grim resolve. He carried a rifle slung across his shoulder, though I wasn't sure if it was for protection against mountain lions or against whatever secrets we might stir loose. We hiked in silence, our boots crunching through snow that reached nearly to our knees. The forest was a cathedral of white, branches heavy with ice, the air sharp enough to sting our lungs. Every sound seemed amplified, the crack of a twig, the distant creak of frozen wood. My nerves buzzed like live wires. When we reached the clearing, the cabin looked even more skeletal under the snow, its blackened beams jutting from drifts like bones. The chimney stood tall, crowned with frost, as if mocking us. Adam stared at it for a long time before finally speaking. "She was here," he whispered. "I can feel it." He crouched near the base, brushing away snow with his gloved hands. That's when he found it, a small metal clasp, half buried in the dirt, tarnished with age. He held it up, eyes wide. "It's from her pack," he said. "I'd know it anywhere." The discovery rattled me. If Claire's belongings were still surfacing here 6 years later, then perhaps more waited beneath the snow and ash. We began to dig, carefully, methodically, using small trowels and our hands. Hours passed, the sun dipping behind the peaks, but our persistence paid off. Adam unearthed something wrapped in brittle fabric, frozen solid. When we pried it open, my breath caught. It was a notebook, the same size and make as the one Hale had described. The edges were scorched, the paper fragile, but legible words still clung to its pages. We carried it back to my truck, hands shaking with anticipation, and spread it open under the dim beam of a flashlight. Most of the writing was ruined, ink blurred by fire and time, but fragments remained. The first page we could read bore a date, July 15th, 2017, 2 days after Claire had set out. The entry was short, hurried. Not alone. Thought I heard footsteps. Not sure if animal. Watching me. My stomach clenched. She had known. She had felt it too, the same presence that now seemed to haunt me. Another fragment read, "Storm coming. Found shelter. Cabin." The word was underlined twice, the ink jagged as though written in haste. And then another entry, the most chilling of all, Sloane. He said name Sloane. The rest of the page was burned away, but those words were enough to freeze the air in my lungs. Someone had spoken to her. Someone tied to the cursed name that kept reappearing in whispers and half-buried histories. Adam slammed his fist against the dashboard. I knew it. She wasn't lost. She was taken. Someone led her here. His voice cracked, torn between triumph and anguish. I couldn't disagree. The evidence was undeniable now. Claire had reached the cabin alive, and she had encountered someone who knew the Sloane name. Whether a descendant, a drifter, or something darker, I didn't yet know. But it meant her disappearance wasn't an accident.
It was an act.
We debated what to do next. Turning the notebook over to authorities would likely bury it again, lost in files or dismissed as inconclusive. But keeping it meant carrying a dangerous weight. Whoever had placed her camera in that chimney might still be out there, watching. If they learned we now held the notebook, what would they do? The thought gnawed at me, but in the end, we decided to keep it secret for now. The truth belonged to Claire, and to those who still fought for her. Over the following days, I scrutinized every surviving page, every mark of ink. The fragments painted a picture of fear and confusion. Claire had sensed someone trailing her. She had veered off the main trail, perhaps guided or forced, until she stumbled upon the cabin. She had tried to write, to document, but fire had nearly erased her testimony. Nearly, but not entirely. Enough remained to prove she had not walked willingly into oblivion. The more I studied the notebook, the more I began to feel as though I were communing directly with her. Her handwriting was frantic, uneven, so unlike the calm captions beneath her photographs. I could almost hear her voice in the scrawls, the rising panic as she realized she was no longer alone in the wilderness. Each word was a plea across time, a lifeline thrown 6 years into the future, into my hands. I promised her silently that I wouldn't let it be wasted. But with every step closer to the truth, the danger grew. Twice I noticed tire tracks near my truck where none should have been. Once, while leaving Adam's house, I spotted a figure across the street, half hidden in shadow, watching. When I shouted, the figure melted into the night. My pulse hammered as I realized that Claire's fate wasn't the only one at stake anymore. The same presence that had circled her was circling me now. Still, I couldn't stop. I followed the trail of the Sloane name through dusty archives, old newspapers, whispered rumors passed down in barrooms and farmhouses. A picture began to emerge of a family marked by violence and isolation, a lineage that faded from official record, but not from memory. Some claimed a Sloane descendant still roamed the mountains, living feral, half-wild. Others swore the family line had ended in madness and blood. But Claire had written the name in her notebook. She had heard it spoken. That meant at least one Sloane had still been alive in 2017 and had crossed her path. As the days grew darker, I felt the line between past and present blurring. I wasn't just telling Claire's story anymore. I was walking inside it. And somewhere out there, in the frozen silence of Montana's wild heart, I knew the one who had spoken that name was still watching, waiting, daring me to come closer. Winter pressed its weight upon Montana, each day shorter, each night deeper. The mountains became a wall of white silence, and in that silence, I felt Claire's voice echo louder. The notebook never left my side. I read it until the words imprinted themselves behind my eyelids, until I could recite them without looking. But what haunted me wasn't just the words, it was what was missing. Half-burned sentences, charred corners that once held truths now lost forever. The gaps taunted me, daring me to fill them in with my imagination, daring me to guess what she had seen in those final days. Adam and I rarely spoke of anything else. We met late in the evenings, poring over maps, tracing trails she might have taken, comparing them against whispered reports of hermits or squatters in the Gallatin Range. He grew more obsessed by the day, anger gnawing at him like frostbite. "They think she wandered off and froze," he'd say, his voice bitter. "They think she was just careless. But she wrote his name. She saw him. That means someone did this to her." He slammed his hand down on the table, rattling coffee cups. "And I'm going to find him." I worried for him, but I couldn't fault his determination. It mirrored my own. Still, obsession is a dangerous fire, one that burns as much as it illuminates. Adam began spending nights alone in the woods, camping near the ruins of the Sloan cabin, as though daring the figure we both believed in to show itself. I joined him once, and I'll never forget that night. The wind moaned through the trees like a chorus of voices. The chimney loomed in the moonlight, a dark spear against the stars. Around 2 a.m, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching snow just beyond the tree line. Adam was already awake, rifle in hand, eyes blazing. But when we shouted into the dark, the footsteps stopped. We searched with flashlights, but found nothing. Only silence, heavy and suffocating. The encounter gnawed at me. If there was someone out there, they were skilled at moving unseen. Skilled at watching. It made sense. If a family had survived in isolation for generations, they'd know every fold of the land better than any hiker or ranger. They'd know how to vanish, like smoke. And perhaps they'd know how to make others vanish too. In January, I drove to Helena to scour the state archives. What I found left me trembling. A thin file, nearly forgotten, contained records of the Sloan family dating back to the 1920s. The patriarch, Elias Sloan, had moved his family deep into the Gallatin wilderness during the Great Depression. Records showed land disputes, arrests for violence, but then nothing. By the 1950s, the family had disappeared from public record altogether. The last entry was chilling, a sheriff's note from 1954. Family reported living wild. Avoid contact. Dangerous. That was the final word. After that, the Sloans became ghosts. I returned to Adam with the file, but instead of caution, it fueled his fury. "They didn't vanish," he spat. "They just went underground. They're still here." And one of them found Claire. His conviction shook me, but so did his recklessness. He began setting traps near the cabin, leaving out food, trying to draw someone out. I feared he was inviting disaster, and I told him so. He only shook his head.
"You don't understand."
"If they took her, they'll come for us too. I want them to. I'm ready." Then one night in February, he didn't come back. His truck sat empty at the trailhead, frost covering the windshield. The search was brief. He was found 2 days later, wandering miles from the cabin, disoriented, with frostbitten hands. He remembered little. Said he'd heard voices in the trees, that he'd followed them, certain he was close. But after that, a blank. His mind was a fog of fear and exhaustion. When I asked if he'd seen anyone, his eyes filled with something worse than fear, shame. "I don't know," he whispered. "Maybe I dreamed it, but I didn't believe that." I saw the scratches on his arms, the bruises around his wrists, marks that didn't look like accidents. Something had happened to him out there. Something that had silenced him. After that, Adam changed. He stopped speaking of the Sloans, stopped camping near the cabin, stopped answering my calls some nights altogether. It was as if the fire in him had been extinguished, replaced by ashes of dread. And I was left alone with the weight of Claire's story. I tried to pick up where he left off. I hiked deeper into the wilderness, carrying Claire's notebook like a compass. I followed unmarked paths, stumbled across strange cairns of stone, symbols carved into bark, places where the forest seemed wrong. Once, I found an old snare, rusted but still functional, hidden under snow. Another time, I found footprints, bare feet, human pressed deep into the frost. They led into a thicket, but vanished as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Each discovery tightened the knot in my chest. Someone was out here, and they were watching me as surely as they had watched Claire. the longer I hunted, the more the wilderness changed around me. The woods no longer felt like wilderness, they felt like territory. Someone's territory. My presence wasn't exploration anymore. It was trespass. At night, I dreamed of Claire, her hands reaching out from the chimney, her voice whispering words I couldn't hear. I woke with her notebook clenched in my fist, as though afraid it might be stolen while I slept. Then came the night I returned to my cabin and found the notebook open on my table. I hadn't left it that way. My blood went cold. I checked every lock, every window, but nothing was broken. Whoever had entered had come and gone without a sound. On the last page of the notebook, one that had been blank before, there were new words, scrawled in a shaky hand. Stop. I stared at it for hours, my breath shallow, my skin crawling. Was it a warning? A threat? Or had Claire herself, somehow, left me one final message through the hands of another?
I didn't know.
All I knew was that the story wasn't finished. And until I uncovered every last piece of it, neither was I. The words scrawled across that last page, stop, echoed in my head like a bell tolling from some far-off cathedral.
Stop searching. Stop asking.
Stop digging. But the more I stared at it, the less it felt like a warning, and the more it felt like a challenge. Whoever had broken into my cabin and written that message knew me well enough to understand it wouldn't end the hunt. If anything, it fanned the fire. Still, fear stalked me now in ways I couldn't shake. Every creak of the cabin boards, every gust of wind rattling the window felt like the breath of someone standing too close in the dark. I no longer felt alone, not even in my own home. Days bled into weeks. Adam wouldn't speak of it anymore. He avoided me, avoided the subject of Claire, avoided everything. He'd been broken by whatever had happened out there, and though I wanted to reach him, I knew the fight in him was gone. That left me. I carried on, but every trip into the mountains took more out of me. The air felt heavier, the woods sharper, the silence darker. Still, I pressed deeper, until one day in late March, I found what I'd been chasing. The snow had begun to melt, leaving patches of earth bare. I followed a narrow draw up into the mountains, drawn by the faintest thread of smoke curling against the gray sky. It wasn't the Chimney ruins. This was further, hidden in a fold of the land I'd never explored. The smoke led me to a structure, half hidden by trees, older than the Sloan cabin, but still standing. Its roof sagged, its windows were black holes, but the chimney still exhaled thin smoke like a secret refusing to die. My heart hammered as I crept closer. Someone was living here. Someone who had survived hidden from the world. The door creaked open when I pushed it. Inside, the air reeked of wood smoke and something metallic. Blood, maybe, or rust. The floor was covered in pelts, bones piled neatly in a corner. A crude table sat in the center, and on it lay objects that froze me in place. A camera, older but intact, scraps of fabric I recognized from the missing persons files, and a tin box filled with trinkets. I reached inside, my hands trembling, and pulled out a silver locket. Inside was a photograph, Claire, smiling, unaware of the fate that awaited her. My breath caught. This was it.
Proof.
Proof that she'd been here, that she'd been taken. Proof that the Sloan name wasn't just a ghost story, but a living shadow. I turned at a sound, soft, deliberate. In the doorway stood a man. His hair was long, matted, streaked with gray. His eyes were pale and unblinking, wild yet oddly calm. He held no weapon, but he didn't need one. The silence between us was sharper than any blade. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice raw, like stone scraping stone. I swallowed hard, forcing words through the knot in my throat.
Claire.
"What did you do to her?" His expression flickered, just for a second, into something unreadable, sorrow, maybe, or recognition. Then it hardened again. "She came where she shouldn't have. Like you." I took a step closer, locket still clutched in my fist. "Her notebook. She wrote your name."
Sloan.
"That's who you are, isn't it? You're one of them." He didn't deny it. He only smiled, thin and cold. "Names don't matter here. The mountain keeps its own." My rage burned through the fear. She was alive when she found that cabin. What did you do to her? Where is she? The man's pale eyes narrowed. She saw too much, asked too much. The mountain doesn't give back what it takes. Before I could speak again, he moved, not toward me, but toward the chimney. He placed his hand on the soot-stained stones like a priest at an altar. This is where she belongs now, he whispered. This is where you'll belong too, if you don't stop. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. I'm not stopping, I said. Not until the truth is out. Not until she's found. His smile widened, though it held no warmth. Then the mountain will take you too. And with that, he slipped past me into the trees, vanishing with a swiftness that left me doubting whether he'd ever been real at all. I staggered out into the cold air, lungs burning. The locket dug into my palm like a wound. I wanted to chase him, but I knew it was useless. He knew these woods better than I ever could. And worse, he wasn't alone. If one Sloane had survived, there might be more. A whole lineage hidden in the folds of the Gallatin wilderness, guarding their secrets, feeding their myths. I left the cabin that night, but not empty-handed. I carried the locket, the camera, the tin box. Artifacts, evidence, pieces of Claire's story no one could deny. Yet when I tried to bring them forward, to show them to the authorities, doors closed quickly. The sheriff shook his head, muttering about trespassing, about fabrication. One deputy told me flat out, "Leave it alone. You don't know what you're stirring." The silence wasn't ignorance, it was fear. Fear of the same name Claire had written. Fear of the same family that had haunted these mountains for nearly a century. So the artifact stayed with me. I became their keeper, their witness. At night, I would spread them out on my table, the notebook, the locket, the scraps, and feel Claire's presence like a candle flame in the dark. She hadn't vanished into nothing. She had left a trail, a story, and I was the last one willing to tell it. Even now, 6 years after her disappearance, I can still hear her voice in the wind when I walk the ridges. I can still see her in the corners of my dreams, reaching out from the chimney, begging not to be forgotten. And I know deep down that the man I saw, the Sloane who still walks those woods, isn't done watching me. One day, he may come back to finish what he started. But until that day, I carry on. I speak her name. I guard her truth. And I wait, because the mountain may keep its secrets, but so do I. And mine is this: Claire was here. Claire was taken. And somewhere in the silence of the Gallatin Range, the last of the Sloanes still breathes. The chimney still stands. The snow still falls. And the mountain still watches. And so do I.